Hi, everybody. Welcome to the wonderful, horrible history of EC Comics. I'm Danny Fingeroth. I am your host, more or less, although much of the storytelling will be done by the author of the book, The Wonderful, Horrible History of EC Comics, Grant Geisman, who has done this book for Taschen that'll be out this fall. And if you know your Taschen books, you remember the hernia-inducing Marvel history and DC history. Well, get your support hose on, because this is going to be another incredible Taschen book that Grant will tell you more about. So I was an editor of Marvel Comics for a lot of years. Some of you probably spent a lot of money buying stuff that I worked on, and I appreciate that. And I'm the author of A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee, which is a biography of Stan Lee. Anyway, we have a great panel to help us talk about the history of EC. So Grant, of course, we'll get to him in a minute. We also have Ari Kaplan.
Well, I am a television comedy writer and a screenwriter for video games and transmedia, also a comic book writer and children's book author. And for many years, I've been a writer for Mad Magazine, which is, as far as I know, the only EC title still in existence talking about EC. And I was also one of the writers on the 2008 relaunch of Tales from the Crypt from Paper Cuts. So those are my EC bona fides in particular.
Cool. Welcome, Ari. And we have Dr. Travis Langley. Travis, who is also directing and producing this panel. So,
hello,
Travis,
Danny and everybody. I am Dr. Travis Langley, Distinguished Professor of Psychology at Henderson State University, best known as the author of the book Batman in Psychology, A Dark and Stormy Night. And I'm happy to talk about comics history and complain about Frederick Wortham.
And by the way, I know you're probably all out there admiring our hairstyles and haircuts, so you can email us separately from the panel to get our tips. And by the way, we hope everybody is doing okay during this epidemic and whatever phase we're in, and thank you for checking us out. Anyway, Grant Geisman, welcome, and thank you for being here and sharing your book with us. So tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll go into this exciting PowerPoint we have lined up.
Okay, well, I'm the author of several previous EC-related books, Collectively Mad, Foul Play, the EC Companion, Tales of Terror, the EC Companion, and I also wrote the biography of Al Feldstein.
Oh, that's right.
Feldstein, the Mad Life and Fantastic Art of Al Feldstein, and then the new book, which we're sort of loosely hanging the panel on from Taschen, is the history of EC Comics.
We'll get to a better shot, but that's the cover of the book, right? Right, Grant?
Yeah. Yep, there it is.
Anyway, who are these fellows?
Well, these are early comic book moguls. MC Gaines is on the left. The little guy in the middle is Harry Donenfeld, and the guy on the right is Jack Leibowitz. MC Gaines started out essentially as a printing broker, and he became the go-to guy for giveaway comics in like very early to mid 30s. And MC Gaines and his editor, Shelley Mayer, recommended to the other two guys that they should publish a little unknown feature called Superman. And but MC Gaines really, he was only interested in the commission that he might make from the sale of the printing, since he was a printing broker. So he basically let, bazillions of dollars slide through his hands and go over to the other two guys.
All right, next, and then
of course, this is the first Superman cover.
All right.
It was an immediate hit.
Sorry.
And so probably as a thank you to MC Gaines, Donenfeld and Leibowitz decided to create a sister company called All American. And they published it was a separate line, but kind of all distributed under the DC banner. And they had characters that are still known today, like Green Lantern, The Flash, and even Wonder Woman were created under MC Gaines's sort of shield.
Oh, okay.
The other thing that MC Gaines was interested in is he thought comics should be an educational medium and not just an entertaining medium. So he published through DC picture stories from the Bible. And actually they sold really well because they were promoted to churches and religious schools and stuff like that. So there were quite a few printings of compilations of picture stories from the Bible. But
Plus, you didn't,
not all that exciting.
didn't have to pay any licensing fees to anybody.
That's true, yeah.
Oh, there's Wonder Woman. Okay.
There's Wonder Woman.
And those are, that's Shelley Mayer in the middle there. And
That's Shelley Mayer. Gaines on the right. H.G. Peter is the second figure. He's the Wonder Woman artist. And the guy on the left is William Moulton Marston, who is the creator of Wonder Woman.
cool. Oh, and there's picture stories from the Bible on the wall there, right behind Mayer.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
So eventually the relationship soured between Gaines and the DC side. So he threw out an ultimatum: you either buy me out or I'll buy you out. So DC bought out MC Gaines, all the rights to all American characters, Green Lantern, Flash, Wonder Woman, and all that stuff. And we're not sure, but we think this is a photo memorializing the sale, and he's handing maybe Gaines's attorney the check.
And do we know who the guy on the left is? Just another attorney, or?
Oh no, that's Leibowitz, Jack Leibowitz.
Oh, that's Leibowitz without his mustache.
Harry Donenfeld, and then we don't know who the guy is. We think an attorney.
Leibowitz without the mustache.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And then there's the MC Gaines. Almost immediately he started EC Comics, taking with him the rights of picture stories from the Bible. And then he also established a line of kiddie comics like Dandy and Animal Fables that you can see there on the stand. And yeah, there you go. So he took with him the exciting picture stories from the Bible title, and then he had a line of comics for very, very young readers. And here's a trade ad, house ad, showing you some of the titles.
And they're educational, EC, educational comics.
They're entertaining and educational.
Wow.
So this is MC Gaines, and the little boy there is about a 2-year-old version of William M. Gaines, who was MC Gaines's son, Bill Gaines.
Wow, that's an incredible picture.
I love that. And there's Bill Gaines. So unfortunately, Max Gaines was killed in a very horrific and tragic boating accident on Lake Placid on August 20th, 1947. And Bill was only maybe like, I don't know, 24, something like that, 23, when he had to step in and take over the company. He had no interest in comics whatsoever. In fact, he hated the whole idea of publishing and comics. And he only sort of stepped into his father's shoes at his mother's insistence. But little by little, he began to love being around creative people, and he sort of fell in love with comics. And he decided to, and then sort of maybe the editors were around him said, why don't you, get away from the kiddie comics and let's try to come up with some titles that might sell. So the only superhero that EC ever published is right in the center of this house ad called Moon Girl, which was kind of a very loosely, shielded knockoff of Wonder Woman.
Wow. And I guess now, did they start the crime trend, or did they jump on the bandwagon?
All these comics were jumping on various bandwagons. So the crime comics, Crime Does Not Pay, the Lev Gleason title was very popular. So they said, oh, we should do some crime titles. And also Western comics were fairly good sellers. Let's do some Western comics. So really they were just jumping on various bandwagons.
Right, okay.
Yeah, I don't think they invented any actual genres, but I mean, they're more known for just stepping up the level of quality in the stories. Like, for example, their horror comics were just a cut above the horror comics.
Well, in the early days, they were jumping on bandwagons. A little further on, you mentioned horror comics, but actually they created some genres. This is Johnny Craig. He was a holdover. He was a very young staff artist, kind of doing, panel racing and just kind of house ads and stuff for MC Gaines. And he ended up kind of coming along for the ride when Bill Gaines took over.
Huh. Let's see, and then, oh, this is more of the line.
Yeah, there's the line.
Um,
And initially they were distributed by McFadden Publications, which didn't usually do comics. They were more like higher class magazines. And And eventually, EC got kicked out by McFadden because they had gone too far. This is Bill Gaines and another young editor that kind of walked in the office one day that Gaines hired, a guy named Al Feldstein.
And now Feldstein had done some work for Stan, very briefly for Stan at Timely, right?
Not for Stan, but he created kind of a lot of good girl art comics like Junior and Sunny, kind of titillating comics for Fox, for Victor Fox, Fox Publications. And that's what got him hired, because he brought on all these covers from Junior and Sunny with, you know, headlight comics, very big boobs and very short skirts. And Bill thought that was just the cat's meow. And so I need to hire this guy. And that's what happened.
He did work for Stan for like 5 minutes. He did
later.
Yeah. Oh, that later on?
After the EC period kind of got around. He wrote the first issue of Yellow Claw for Stan.
Oh, okay.
I knew at some point he had worked for Stan. And then these
And that's in the EC office. That's Johnny Craig, Al Feldstein, and Bill Gaines looking over a story.
Wow. More.
Eventually, they abandoned all the kind of chasing the bandwagon, and they decided they both were fans of, you know, radio shows like Lights Out, Arch Obler's Lights Out, and Witch's Tale on the radio. And they said, why don't we do horror comics? Feldstein was a very energetic writer, artist, and he kind of pushed Gaines, like, let's not, you know, play follow the leader, let's come up with our own stuff. And they also came out with science fiction comics, Weird Science there. There were kind of science fiction sort of comics, but they were more like space opera. And EC actually created the very first proper science fiction comics that weren't like cowboys in space, but, you know, really science fiction stories in comics. And
it's very interesting that Gaines was training to be a chemistry teacher, I think, right?
He was. He actually, I think he got his degree. That's, like, again, he had no interest in comics.
That's what I'm saying, that he segued into this, you know, so naturally is sort of interesting, you know?
Yeah,
It's funny. He found that he liked being creative and being around creative people, and it's funny how it worked out.
Let's see, and then this is Gaines and
Gaines and Johnny Craig.
Boy, I gotta say, the Gaines family was not vain about how they looked in pictures. You know, I mean, especially Johnny Craig is like, you know, movie star good looking, and Gaines is still, all right, I'll take my picture next to this guy. And, you know.
Yeah, it's like a before and after photo, yeah.
So far and away, their most popular title was Tales from the Crypt. And in fact, the horror comics were, you know, sort of carrying the load for the whole company. Gaines was an interesting publisher. He felt as long as the company was making money overall, it didn't matter if they were titles that were like marginal, like making a little money or even losing money a little bit. The science fiction comics ended up losing a little money, but they loved doing it. But he felt as long as the overall company was making a profit, let's keep it all going. We love these titles, let's not drop them.
I know
and that's the first issue of Weird Science.
Well,
It says number 12. Is that?
Oh, well, so Gaines, among other things, was kind of cheap. So in the old days, to get a second-class postal permit, you had to pony up $2,000, which they would hold on deposit to start a new title. But if you continued the numbering from an old title and sort of convinced the post office that it really wasn't a title change, it was just the same title, only different, you would save $2,000. So sometimes they got away with it and sometimes they didn't.
And Timely did that quite a bit in the 50s and 60s.
Oh, constantly.
Captain America mystery comics that then became something else and so on.
Well, even Moon Girl ended up with like a
that's the funniest one. It was Moon Girl, and then to try to save the $2,000, it became a Moon, a Girl romance.
Yeah.
The post office didn't buy it.
neither did the fans, apparently. But.
No, that's exactly right.
So you can't. I mean, this. You know, back in the day in comics, even in the 70s, 80s, even into the 90s, the idea was, but especially in the 60s and the 50s, obviously the theory was if you put a lot of text on a cover, it would kind of make a reader spend time with it, and then they were sort of committed and they'd buy it. I mean, this takes that to an extreme with these word balloons.
Yeah.
And Feldstein in general was a very wordy writer. Like the old joke is there would be so much text that there was no room for the artist to draw anything. And there's actually examples of panels where there are literally stick figures at the bottom because the text is covering up the whole panel.
You know, that figure in the background is really horrific, that human that body that's kind of being torn to pieces.
Well, it's a robot.
Yes, I know, but it's pretty.
Yeah, it's still very disturbing looking.
It's a weird fantasy, you know.
EC also actually was literally the first company to do stories about taboo subjects like racism, bigotry, police corruption, police brutality, anti-Semitism, stuff like that. So, and they called those stories internally, they called them preachies because they were kind of preaching a message to the readers. And this was very unusual, and especially in kind of Midwest, certain parts of the country, you know, they had never read anything like this. And really there was nothing like this in comics before. This is a story, some cops pick up an African-American guy and who they think has committed a murder, and they sort of try to coerce a confession out of him. And eventually they force him to run so they can shoot him as escaping. And then they get back to the station and they say, well, we got the guy, he's right in the back seat there, you know, he's dead, whatever. And then the other cop says, no, we have the killer, he's in jail, he confessed. So they've killed an innocent man. And sadly, this has echoes today of what's happening right now. But, you know, this was like in the early 50s. This is, you know, virtually unheard of in comics at the time.
Yeah. And Grant, as you say, you know, it's still very timely today. But my question to you is, do you think that, obviously, yes, and internally they called them preachies, and that certainly implies that they had a bit of a sense of humor, the fact that, yes, it's all in good fun, it's all comics. But they were dealing with, like you said, very, very sensitive issues, some of which were very taboo at the time. And you don't see very many comics about police brutality today in 2020. Do you think that in the 50s, Feldstein and Gaines felt that there was any kind of like that they were morally obligated to tell stories like this?
I do think so. You know, both Gaines and Feldstein were Jewish, so whatever that brought with them, you know, in their upbringing, they were both very liberal. So I think they, even though it was comics and even though it was entertainment, I think through stories like this, they did want to send a message, and they did think it was an obligation. I think so.
Yeah.
This is Gaines and Feldstein at work at Gaines's desk.
Yeah, I wonder if they really wore ties and suits to go to work, or if this was just.
Well, I don't think Gaines did every day, and you can actually see that he's kind of unshaven that day. And apparently, you know, that was kind of common for Bill. He might go 3 or 4 days without shaving, but Feldstein was always very dapper. He always had cool ties, and you know, it's just different. But these guys were like brothers at this time. I mean, you know, they plotted stories together. Feldstein was Gaines's right-hand man. They were buddies.
Boy, that's a book there, just the story of those two guys.
Yeah.
Has anyone done a full biography of Gaines?
Well, yeah. The Mad World of William M. Gaines by Frank Jacobs, which came out in 1972, so a while now, but that's a beautiful book. It's got incredible stories about the early days and Mad magazine and stuff.
And then I had dinner with Frank Jacobs a long time ago because I was hosting a panel on Mad in LA, and so he and I were talking, and he said that and this is a long time ago, so I may be a little fuzzy on the details. It's 15 years ago or so, and he was telling me that someone had optioned the book, and they were trying, I think HBO maybe, someone was trying to turn it into a movie, and I think Jack Black was mentioned as a possible contender for the role of, a long time ago, but
yeah, I think there's been several attempts to make, you know, a kind of an EC movie based on Gaines and that story. But you know how it is in Hollywood, those things end up in development hell and may not happen.
And so now tell us about this. They were very involved with their fans. So
very involved. They ran letter columns in pretty much every issue, and they kind of made their artists into stars, like so that the fans would know who was drawing what. And the extension of that was to create an EC Fanatic Club. So for a quarter, you got a membership kit with a bronze pin and a certificate and an ID card and a shoulder patch. And actually, it's very cool. And Gaines said in an interview in the mid-50s, they actually lost about 5 cents on every kit they sold. But he didn't care. He just, you know, again, Gaines was a very unusual publisher. It's like, as long as the overall thing was making money, we can do these goofy little fun things. This is Two-Fisted Tales, one of the war titles, done by Harvey Kurtzman, who was another young artist that kind of showed up at EC looking for work. And he pitched Gaines on the idea of doing a real-life, true-to-life war comic. You know, you guys can chime in on this too, but up to now, most war comics sort of, you know, demonized the enemy and glorified, you know, the rah-rah American troops. And Kurtzman's philosophy was he wanted to show, you know, war comics that would be more true to life.
Well, and this was during the Korean War, right? Which was not a very popular. It was never even called a war. It was like a police action.
Right, exactly.
But I think it was sort of almost a precursor to the divided feelings about Vietnam. I think Korea was sort of something people didn't really understand clearly why we were there. It was, I guess, officially a UN mission. And so Kurtzman really took a very jaundiced view of war. Do you know, was Kurtzman inspired by any particular movies or books or radio shows, or was this pretty much Harvey's inspiration?
I think it was his inspiration. He worked very hard on these war books. Actually, he sort of ran himself ragged doing it because he felt like he couldn't write a story unless he did all the research, and he'd go down to the public library in Manhattan and spend hours. You know, Gaines and Feldstein would plot a story. Feldstein would go to his office for maybe 3-4 hours, knock out the story, one story a day, next day, different story for a different artist. He'd crank out, you know, 4 comic stories in a week. And Kurtzman took, you know, forever to create even one story.
That's Kurtzman and Gaines.
Yeah, it sure is.
And I think a rarity for like the 50s, air conditioning.
Right.
This is a famous quote on the
I'm going to interject one thing, if it's okay.
You don't have to ask permission. That's we're having a panel after.
No, this goes just because it goes back to like a couple slides ago, but like the whole thing about the house ads, I think is important to mention, is that because of the Fanatic Club, because of the house ads that were very funny and very clever in their own right, and were like comic book stories of their own, and because of the fact that Gaines sort of implemented a kind of a star system where he really promoted the artists as well as the stories. Didn't really promote the writers, and it's not like I'm upset about that as a writer myself. I'm not like
I think that would have been promoting himself, you know.
That is promoting himself, because it's like look at what a good eye for talent I have.
Which Stan would never do. Never mind. Anyway, though.
No, but what I was just going to say is that I think that was a big influence on the way Stan.
Oh yeah.
Ran things at Marvel in the '60s, which I'm sure obviously Danny.
Yeah, and Stan always denied it, but it was clear that he was doing. You know, that's a whole other panel. But you know, Stan would say that he was, and I'm sure it's partly true, that he was inspired by these books he read as a kid. These a series of children's books that came out on a regular basis and had letter columns. And I'm sure he was, but even though he and Kurtzman were friends, I just think he would never say, "Oh yeah, I was doing what they did at EC," although it was clear that he was influenced by that.
Oh, that's interesting.
So tell us about this. This is one of the most famous EC stories of all time.
It is. And again, it's, you know, it shows a body just floating down a river, and it kind of tells this whole story. Again, Harvey not wanting to glorify war, you know, kind of show how horrific it actually is. And this is a famous battle sequence in here.
Now,
But
I'm sorry.
Harvey edited these as well, right?
He wrote.
Well, yeah, he edited them and wrote the stories, and in this case, he actually illustrated the story as well.
No, I can see that, but the reason I'm asking is because I'm just wondering, it's still a 1950s comic book, and it's still ostensibly for children. Were there ever any battles with Gaines or Feldstein over content in something like this?
No, not at all. Again, Gaines is a very unusual publisher, and he actually said that he didn't understand a lot of the times why Harvey would do something like this, but he loved it. He loved what Harvey did, but this is something Gaines would never do on his own. He would, he loved horror comics, he loved science fiction, but he let Harvey do it.
Yeah, and a lot of it is told in the second person. Suddenly your mind is quiet and your rage collapses. You're tired. It's a real pulpy kind of film noir, almost kind of thing. That second person is a certain kind of feel it gives to a story.
It makes it feel a little more like a prose short story as well.
Right. And then
so, because of all the work that it took Harvey to write these war stories, he was editing two titles, Two-Fisted Tales and another title called Frontline Combat. And again, he was writing them all, editing, and it was killing him, A, and B, he wasn't really making that much money because Gaines paid per title, not by how long it took to do a title. So Feldstein was cranking out like 7 EC titles to Kurtzman's 2, and Feldstein was raking it in, and Harvey was struggling. So
they were cut in for a piece of the profits on it? Was that the idea?
No piece of the profits. Just like they had an X amount of dollars. This is how much you make to edit, bring in this issue,
okay, so it was,
whatever. Yeah, no piece of the profits at all.
But their income was tied to the number of titles they did.
Yeah, their output, essentially, yeah. So Gaines said, look, Harvey, if you can come up with another title that, something you can do easily that won't take all this research, your income goes up by 50%. And Gaines said, Harvey had shown like his Hey Look pages and the early stuff that he had done for Stan Lee, which Gaines and Feldstein loved. So Gaines said, look, you did all that humor stuff, why don't you do a humor comic? And that's how Mad was born. This is the first issue.
Oh dear, wow.
This is the whole EC staff. It's a house ad for Mad #1.
And Feldstein has his signature on his head.
Exactly. This is a cover rough for the cover actually of Mad #4. And we think Harvey did a similar cover rough like this for every issue, but I think there's only 4 or 5 cover roughs like this that are known to still exist.
Did Harvey actually save any time doing Mad, or was he just?
Well, of course, that's the irony, because once he got into doing Mad, he had to give up Frontline Combat because Mad was taking all of his time, and he was taking forever writing these humorous stories.
Yeah, and I'd imagine like with the King Kong parody, Ping Pong, he must have had to watch King Kong a bunch of times just for research. That's several hours right there.
And how would you watch it? I mean, King Kong was being showed in the afternoon on TV, I think, maybe by then, but you couldn't go to the theater. Oh, maybe there was a reissue in the theater at that moment. So they could go to the theater and watch the reissued version of King Kong.
Well, he might have had the movies, the cinematic picture books. They were popular at the time. There were a lot of movies in which they would have these picture books. Like Bill Finger was big on using those for references.
I'm guessing Harvey was one of those kids who probably went to see it when it was running in the theaters 10 times.
He probably had the movie memorized,
But Bat Boy and Reuben is one of their, it seems to be a satire of some sort.
It is, you think? So the first parody of a DC character was Super Duperman in Mad #4. And apparently DC Comics were not amused, and they actually threatened legal action. So you see the little note on the left there. Notice this story is a lampoon. If you want to spend your time on cheap, rotten lampoons like this instead of the ever-loving, genuine, real thing, go right ahead, boy. But this is kind of a disclaimer that they put there for DC because they didn't want to get sued.
The text at the top, which, this is a story about 2 different people. It's not possibly about Batman and Robin.
No, exactly. This is not what you think it is.
But the other thing about that too, and I know that MAD was very like they were involved in a landmark court case about this in the '60s. What I'm about to say, but about the First Amendment covering parody and satire, you know, and the fact that like they don't need to get the rights from DC to do this, the permission, right? Sort of in the same way that Saturday Night Live doesn't need to get Donald Trump's permission to do a parody of him, you know. But I don't know, maybe, I'm not sure if the copyright laws were different back then, but I imagine the First Amendment still did cover parody and satire in the 1950s, correct?
Well, it covered it, but in the 50s, it really hadn't been fully tested. Like, I forget the name of the movie, but oh, Gaslight. Darn, I'm not going to remember this story well. But a comedy TV show, might have been, I can't remember who is the, but anyway, they did a parody of Gaslight, but they copied the original movie Gaslight so closely that they actually were sued and they lost that battle because the judge ruled it wasn't enough of a parody and it was too close to the original. So you know, these things weren't fully kind of vetted yet.
Well, the Marx Brothers made a movie called A Night in Casablanca, right? That they got a nasty letter from Warner's about, which I think Groucho actually pumped it up to be much more of a controversy than it was to publicize the movie. And he wrote this famous letter, you know, saying that, you know, that he was going to sue the Warner Brothers because the Marx Brothers were calling themselves brothers before the Warner Brothers were.
That's fantastic. I love it.
Anyway, Travis, I assume we don't have much time, but what the hell? We'll just keep going.
Keep going.
Tell us about this.
This is just another early MAD story illustrated by Bill Elder. Elder was famous, you can't really see it in this example, but he was famous for putting all kinds of crazy signs and gags in the background, which they later called chicken fat. So.
And I find it fascinating. This is something but way back before the pandemic, do you guys remember what life was like back then? It's so long ago.
No, it's very blurry in my memory.
I used to do these lectures in public places before crowds of people. Wow. And hopefully still will do someday, on the history of Jews in the comic book industry. I even wrote a book on that subject called From Krakow to Krypton. And I talk a lot about the fact that the first story in the first issue of MAD is called GANEFS, which is a Yiddish term for thieves. And I just find it so fascinating that that's what Kurtzman decided to title his story. Like, who is going to get that reference? Because,
you know, these were kind of liberal New Yorkers, and certainly this, you know, for people even in California, but certainly in the Midwest, you know, this was very eye-opening to have this kind of Jewish culture and Yiddish, you know, nothing like this had really ever been done before.
No.
And it did set the stage for Saturday Night Live and a lot of what, you know, what
absolutely
humor
this
now.
Is a house ad. You know, MAD ended up going on to be extremely influential to people like Robert Crumb and a lot of the underground artists. And you see Melvin Goomba here with the two heads.
Well, yeah, it's, you know, I mean, and then MAD sparked a lot of imitators, but none of them, you know, I mean, I don't think any of them really came close.
No.
This is Marie Severin, who was EC's colorist starting in 1951. And she was actually one of the very few women working in comics at the time. And starting in 1951, she colored literally every story and cover that EC published. She was an incredible colorist, and then she went on to have a really nice career at Marvel in later years.
And she could draw superheroes and funny stuff. She had a wide range. Here's a landmark.
Now we're getting into Travis territory. One of the most notorious EC stories is this story called Foul Play, about a baseball game. And Travis can speak to this, but really since comics were invented, there were anti-comics forces saying, you know, comics are bad for you and they ruin kids' eyes, and they, you know, it's not proper literature and it rots their minds and all this kind of stuff. So there was a lot of anti-comic sentiment building up for many years, and it all kind of came to a head with this guy, Dr. Frederick Wortham, and his book, Seduction of the Innocent. So you want to chime in a bit, Travis? and just happens to have a reprint of it right there.
Yeah, Dr. Frederick Wortham, psychiatrist. I, as a psychologist, always have to point out he was a psychiatrist, not a psychologist.
Okay.
He'd been on his own campaign against comics since '48. He'd been doing research for 2 years, and we know from Carol Tilley many years later that he misrepresented a whole lot of his research. But even if he had presented things straightforward, it's a matter of interpretation. The man worked with some juvenile delinquents and would say, so I've worked with all these juvenile delinquents, and not one kid who went bad had not read comics. Well, they had all watched baseball too. So why not blame baseball? His focus was on these comic books. He was actually liberal. He had been involved in landmark cases involving insanity case, and he testified in Brown versus Board of Education. But he had a war against comics. Yeah, and you see the burnings there. So they were going on in the 40s. And they were actually starting to kind of die out until EC's boom of popularity with their books got them worked up again.
My favorite, that's my favorite comics burning story is told
Paul
by
Levitz?
No, Roy Thomas. Roy, in Missouri, Roy, I guess Roy's parents brought him to a comics burning, but what he managed to do was he put the comics he brought in the fire, but he managed to pull out a bunch of comics he hadn't read yet that hadn't been burned yet. So he actually used it as kind of a stealth swap meet, to get to complete his collection with stuff he hadn't read. So
Wortham's book became a bestseller. It's actually, I hate to admit, it's actually pretty well written. It's the ideas. I think the way it's very readable is part of what helped it infect people and think, oh, those comics must be bad. It's just after World War II, people were trying to figure out why there was this increase in juvenile delinquency. Now, over in England, they studied other things. They studied the breakdown of family dynamics during the war. Over in America, well, they didn't want to blame the family. They blamed comics. They'll then blame TV, but they had comics first. And rock and roll too. Rock and roll.
And what I love is that the title is just as sensationalistic as any EC title, Seduction of the Innocent. I mean, it's really...
He hated that title. Wortham did not want that.
Oh, really?
His publisher picked that title, so it would sell.
Quote, I think.
So between the effect that his campaign was having and Senate hearings looking at comics,
and as you were saying, he was progressive. He opened a free clinic, a free psychiatric clinic in Harlem. I mean,
he charged a quarter. He was called Dr. Quarter. He believed in charging that quarter so people would be more invested in their own health, their own treatment.
Oh, and then here's another burning. And here's...
This is one of the ones they discussed, at the Senate hearings, where Bill Gaines, people talk like Bill Gaines was on even more drugs than he was at the hearing. It's he was on stimulants. He'd been very sleep deprived preparing for the hearing, and he went on after Wortham, and here he was sleep deprived and overstimulated, and listening to Wortham got him worked up.
Well, initially he performed well. He and his business manager, Lyle Stewart, had stayed up pretty much the whole previous night, drafting actually this really brilliant defensive comics on First Amendment grounds, and also citing experts that say, comics are a healthy outlet for children. It helps them, kind of indulge their fantasies without causing any actual real harm and stuff like. It was a wonderful statement, which he read into the record. But of course, the senators were not having any of that, and they hammered away at him. And the one cover that we just talked about, that Crime Suspense Stories 22 cover, which they were just horrified by, and Gaines had said, they asked him.
Well, they should have been.
Well, they asked him, is there any, limit as to what you will put on a cover? And he said, no, only within the bounds of good taste. And they were shocked by this, and they said, well, how could this be worse? And Gaines said, and this is true, actually, when Johnny Craig brought the cover in, the head was held just an inch or so higher, so you could actually see the blood dripping out of the bottom of the severed head there. And Gaines said, that's a little too much, so bring it down so it's not quite as bad. Well, the senators just had a field day with this, and not only the senators, but virtually every news report after the hearings mentioned the severed head affair and this terrible publisher from New York that's, you know, ruining our children and exposing them to this filth. So this is a quite notorious cover at this
Well,
point.
from New York is code for Jewish, but you know, yeah, that
So you're just going to mention it.
Gaines was the only publisher, you know, brave / foolhardy enough to actually testify.
Yeah.
Martin Goodman didn't. I don't think anybody from DC did.
He had
Right.
this wonderful speech.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the reactions were bad because of what they were going to focus on and what the reporters were going to tell of it, because most people
Well,
didn't.
go back one. So eventually, because of the public outcry, even though his EC horror comics were still selling well, his horror and crime comics, he decided to drop the whole line of horror and crime comics. And here he is at a news conference in the EC office, ripping up an issue of Vault of Horror, saying he's dropping his titles. And they started a new line of comics, which, well, this is a different thing.
Okay. Sorry. Okay.
Anyway, they started a new line of comics, which they called the New Direction, which
That's
for
wonderful.
several reasons they sold quite poorly. This was the very final comic that EC ever published, which was Incredible Science Fiction number 33. They had a story by Angelo Torres, which had a mutant in the last panel. And by then the comics code had come into effect, and Feldstein used to have to take whole issues. He would go down to the comics code office and sit there while Judge Murphy looked through the stories and blue penciled stuff that he had to change. And so they got to the last panel that had a mutant, and Judge Murphy, the comics code czar, said, "You can't have a mutant in the story." And Feldstein said, "Well, where in the code does it say you can't have a mutant?" And Murphy said, "No, we're throwing this out. That's it." So they decided to reprint a story they had done in an earlier issue called Judgment Day, which is another kind of one of their preachies, but done in a science fiction title. And it was an allegory about racial equality. This guy comes down from the Galactic Empire to see if this particular planet is suitable to join the Galactic Empire, if they're suitably evolved. But the whole planet is segregated in orange and blue robots, identical except for the color. And so as the story goes on, it's decided that they weren't ready to join the Great Galactic Republic because segregation still is the rule on their planet. And then in the last panel, he removes his space helmet and it's revealed that he is a black man, African-American man. And Feldstein even wrote kind of a Ray Bradbury kind of beautiful little coda, said the instrument lights made the beads of perspiration on his dark skin twinkle like distant stars. Well, Murphy got to this last panel and said, "Well, you can't have a black man in the last panel." And Feldstein said, "Well, that's the whole point of the story. You know, I don't get it. And B, where does it say you can't have a black man in the code?" And Murphy said, "Well, I don't care. You got to take it out." And so Feldstein went back to the office, and Gaines had a cow. He just freaked out. He called up Murphy and told him to F off. And they published it anyway. But the kicker was, Murphy said, "Okay, it can be an African-American man, but you have to take the beads of perspiration off his skin." And Gaines told him to screw off, and they published it anyway. But those were crazy times. It's kind of, you know, in retrospect, you can't even imagine that this happened.
So EC actually did belong to the code briefly, huh? I didn't
They
know.
had to join at the very end because their comics just weren't even getting on the newsstand. They were just being blacklisted.
Well, Gaines kind of got it started. He just quickly lost control to everyone
Yeah,
else.
he thought what he wanted to do is get all the publishers together, and he convened several meetings, which he paid for the hall and everything. And he proposed, you know, getting all the publishers together, hiring their own PR agent to kind of counteract all this negative publicity that comics were getting. But the upshot was the other publishers took control of it and decided to cave into the comics code and fund the comics code and all this stuff. So basically Gaines got screwed out of his own meeting.
And we have one of their famous letter columns.
Oh, this is a Ray Bradbury letter congratulating them on the story Judgment Day. which should be required reading for every man, woman, and child in the United States. Pretty strong stuff from Mr. Bradbury.
Cool. And yes, this is part of how they were so involved with their fans and got the fans involved with them, not just printing letters, but printing very personal kind of responses. Again, that inspired Stan, I think, in the 50s. I'm sorry, in the 60s.
This is a Jack Davis kind of little cartoon of Bill burying his horror comics. Those given as a gift to Gaines. These are some of the New Direction comics. The closest thing to what they had been publishing, even though most of it had to go under the code, was Impact.
Cool. And piracy, which I guess Alan Moore picked up on for in Watchmen. You know. Oh, here's some of the New Directions.
Yeah.
Psychoanalysis. Wow.
Now, that's just the craziest idea for a comic book. Gaines and Feldstein were both in analysis, and they thought, hey, wouldn't that be interesting to do a comic book showing how analysis works? I mean, who's going to buy
Sometimes
that?
in here, they were also taking their shots at Wortham, you know, in some of their stories, making the psychiatrist seem like just a little too entertained by what he was listening to.
I think psychiatry was starting to become popular in movies and novels of the era too. But yes, it was on. I mean, it's just a pretty unwieldy logo, you know. They didn't call it like Doc Bullets or something. They call it psychoanalysis.
I mean, I love this cover with the woman with her, arm on her forehead with the eyeballs coming in the background, and this very Freudian kind of.
It's a great cover. And did they ever name? They just called him the psychiatrist. Did he ever have a name?
You got me there. I don't remember.
I've never seen an actual in-person issue of Psychoanalysis. And
I think, yeah.
And then this was.
There's a picture of Wortham, I think in the 70s, actually reading an issue of Shock Illustrated. This is another thing EC tried, a magazine, so they could sort of avoid the code. And Pictofiction was kind of a combination of prose, text with some illustrations. And there's old Wortham reading in the same issue there.
Okay, and then here's a close-up of Psychoanalysis.
This poor woman.
Wow. This is
Bernie Krigstein, who was one of the kind of groundbreaking artists. Very different. This is his most famous story called Master Race. Krigstein became famous for these kind of jump cut panels. You see the bottom panel on the right there. It's a subway car going by, but actually there's a lot of motion there. It's incredible the way he divided up that panel.
He brought a real modern sense of design that nobody else was doing to comics.
True. And this story, Master Race, is actually regarded as one of the best, comic book stories to ever be created.
I think it was maybe the first story to ever even deal at all with the Holocaust.
I think that's true.
Yeah. It's it deals with a death camp commandant and one of the survivors, meeting each other on a New York subway, and it's got a shock twist ending, which I won't give away, even though it's like 70 years since it came out. But
yeah.
But it really dealt with some intense issues that, even for EC, were pretty intense. And then
and here we are with Matt. So Harvey Kurtzman always felt like he was slumming in the world of comic books, and he convinced Gaines to turn Mad into a magazine, which is where Harvey always wanted to be, like in the world of slick, kind of classy magazines. So Gaines let him turn Mad into a magazine. With issue 24, but by issue 28, Harvey and Gaines had kind of reached an impasse. Harvey demanded 51% of the business because he thought without Harvey thought without himself there would be no Mad. So he pulled a power play, and Gaines said, well, I can't give you 51% of the business. And Harvey's like, you'll be sorry. And it's like, okay, bye, Harvey.
I've heard it theorized by many people over the years that the reason he did that, like whether he was serious or not, whether he was seriously doing a power play, or whether he just wanted to be fired and this was the way to go about doing it. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
whether he thought that Gaines would actually take it seriously or not. I've heard like a couple different opinions on that. Where do you stand?
It's hard to say. Gaines ended up offering him actually a 10% stake in MAD, which he would, if he would have taken it, would have made him, like, over the many years, like a multimillionaire.
Yeah.
But Harvey said, no, I want control or I'm out of here. And that's what happened. He left for browner pastures.
And there's a famous story that Al Jaffe tells, that Al had been working for Stan at Timely for about, I guess it was Atlas at that point, for about 10 years. And they had an argument, Stan and Al had an argument, even though in general they got along. And Al sort of impulsively quit because Harvey had offered him a job. And Al said, okay, called up, okay, Harvey, I'm ready to come over to MAD. And Harvey said, well, I just quit MAD, Al. But don't worry, I'll come up with something else. And he did, but that's another panel. But
Timing is everything.
Yeah.
This is a Jack Ricard illustration.
Speaking of timing,
Here we are with Alfred morphing into Bill Gaines.
okay, we're going to move quickly, but
That's Al Jaffe and Bill Elder at the High School of Music and Art.
right, which is where a lot of the MAD guys met up. A lot of them knew each other.
Yeah.
Music and art.
Feldstein went there as well.
Right, and so did Severin and Kurtzman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And here's Al Jaffe, who just now retired from active work at age 99.
And this is one of his famous snappy
answers. Yeah.
questions, which became a MAD mainstay.
We talked about how EC Comics influenced the underground artists. There was a guy called Gary Arlington who was a huge EC fan, and one of the few people that bought multiple copies of EC Comics right off the newsstands and saved them in virtually mint condition. And then he started a comic shop in San Francisco in like very early, like 67 or 68. And he would loan his EC Comics to various underground artists like Crumb or Bill Griffith or Rory Hayes, all these people.
So Grant, it's kind of, while you're talking, I'll kind of go through these.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a Kim Deitch illustration. That's Gary Arlington.
Yeah, the underground.
The Bible was a happening, and so was EC. There's a Greg Irons cover. See, underground comic, but very EC influence, even with a kind of stylized EC logo up there. For a while, Gary Arlington was making these kind of what-if covers and publishing them as a series of little single-sheet nickel library pages. And at first, Bill Gaines was amused by this. He actually signed it up at the top there.
Right.
But then after a while, Gary kept it going, and Bill Gaines finally had to send him a cease and desist letter.
Ironic, huh? And this is looks like a recent updating from Paper Cuts of Tales from the Crypt.
Is this one of the things you worked on, Ari?
This is one of the things I worked on. Yeah, it's actually, I wrote that story. It's called Jumping the Shark. It's the reality TV show producer, his assistant murders him, and then the producer comes back to life as a zombie who's pitching shitty reality show ideas.
And here is Al. I think this is Al at only like 97 or so, at age 97.
Yeah.
So when MAD was sort of canceled, even though it's still kind of going.
Reprints only so far.
Right.
Well, largely reprints. There's some new material as well.
And then here's the actual cover of your book, Grant.
Yep, coming out.
Cover. And when are they predicting? I know publishing in general is kind of in turmoil now, but in theory, when is your book coming out?
They say, let's see, late September or early October, maybe like October 1st, just in time for Halloween.
Ah, excellent.
And it literally is a history of EC Comics, starting in 1933 up through 1956 when they had to drop their comics, and then there's an aftermath chapter kind of dealing with what happened after that and all the echoes that still happen related to EC.
And it's from Taschen, and who are known for the quality.
It is giant, oversized coffee table book.
So is this going to be one of those? It's going to be the size of the DC?
Yeah, the size of those Marvel and DC
Wow.
books. Yeah, not quite as many pages, but that that big size.
Everybody start working out now so you can actually lift it.
That's right.
Okay, and then, so we're wrapping up. So you panelists, now is the time to plug what you've done and what you got coming up. So Travis, what do we have here?
We have here my first book, for which I'm best known, Batman and Psychology, A Dark and Stormy Night, the best book on Batman ever written by me. And most recently, Anthology, for which I wrote about 65% of it, and then I have other people contributing, The Joker Psychology, Evil Clowns, and The Women Who Love Them.
And you got some pretty good people writing the forwards. You have Michael Uselin on the Joker, and
Michael wrote forward on both books. Denny O'Neil wrote a forward in the Batman book and did an interview for the Joker book.
and of course we you know, as of this recording, we just lost Denny within the past week. Denny, well, you should, if you don't know who Denny O'Neil is, look him up, because he was one of the big, great figures of comics from the 60s till now. And Ari Kaplan, what do we got here?
So on the left, you got From Krakow to Krypton, Jews and Comic Books. One of my most well-known books. It's a nonfiction book about the history of Jews in the comic book industry, and there is actually a large section on EC and Tales from the Crypt and the other horror and sci-fi comics that EC published in the 50s in that book. I interviewed Al Jaffe for that book and a few other EC folks. Then in the middle, you have Star Wars Adventures Fight the Empire. It's volume 9 of the Star Wars Adventures trade paperback collections. And this Star Wars Adventures volume 9, it came out last month in June.
You can find it. Ask for it by name. And what's in the last one? What's the Batman?
Last one is Harley at Bat. It's a children's book I wrote. It's Batman versus Harley Quinn. It's a lot of fun. I'm very proud of it.
And look, oh my God, there's a cover of the very subtly colored my biography of Stan Lee, and it is it's a biography of Stan. I have some of the last interviews. It's unauthorized, but I did interview Stan twice. I interviewed dozens of people for this, including his brother Larry Lieber and Denny O'Neil and Al Jaffe, and on and on and on. Anybody and everybody who worked with Stan, who loved him, hated him, or ambivalent about him. You know, it's been, most reviewers think of it as a pretty even-handed look at Stan and his accomplishments and his complicated relationships with Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, and many other people. And so this, as I said, we made this very subtle red cover. It's out. There's an audiobook, there's a large type book, and the paperback is coming out in September. And then, so we have reached the end. So Travis, you want to maybe bring us back to, so everybody can see us? All right, so let me, that's the end of the panel. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, audience. This is so surreal doing a panel with not knowing who's seeing us, but hope you enjoyed it. Hope everybody is and stays healthy. Let's do this next year, actually, in San Diego. Thank you, Ari. Thank you, Travis. Thank you, Grant.
Thank you.
Thanks, Danny.
My pleasure. Take care, everybody.
Bye, bye, bye.